All right, let's just jump right in. We're going to be talking about a time when the world map, as we know it, basically got ripped up and redrawn. After 1900, the great global empires started to fall apart, giving birth to a whole host of new nations. And believe it or not, the aftershocks of that massive change, we are absolutely still feeling them today. I mean, have you ever really looked at a map and asked yourself, wait, who decided that line goes there? It's a great question because most of us just take it for granted, right? But these borders weren't just neatly drawn. In many cases, they were violently carved out of collapsing empires. And that process, well, it was anything but simple. And just to give you a sense of the sheer scale of this transformation, we're talking about more than 80 new countries appearing on the world stage after 1900. Think about that, 80, each one born from the ashes of old colonial powers. It was a fundamental, ground-up redrawing of the entire global political landscape. But here's the thing, and this is really the key point. Gaining independence, that wasn't the finish line. It wasn't the happy ending. For so many of these new nations, it was more like the starting gun for a whole new race filled with immense challenges, from brutal wars to economic chaos. So let's start with one of the biggest and most immediate problems, the borders themselves. The very lines on the map that were supposed to define these new nations often became the front lines for some incredibly bitter and long-lasting conflicts. The core of the problem was how these lines were drawn. You have to remember, the European colonial powers drew them to suit their own needs, for access to resources, for strategic advantage. They really didn't pay much attention to the actual people living there, the different ethnic groups, religions, or tribes they were suddenly splitting apart or forcing together. So these new states inherited a real mess. And there is probably no more devastating example of this than the partition of India in 1947. The initial hope, the dream, was for a single, unified India for both Hindus and Muslims. But the Muslim League was deeply worried about being marginalized in a country with a huge Hindu majority. That fear is what fueled the call for a completely separate nation, Pakistan. What happened next was one of the largest and fastest human migrations in history. As soon as those new borders were announced, about 12 million people suddenly found themselves on the wrong side. You had a massive flood of Muslims heading to the newly created Pakistan, and Hindus and Sikhs desperately fleeing south into India. And let's be clear, this was not a peaceful exchange of populations. It was chaos. The migration exploded into horrific sectarian violence. The estimated death toll is just staggering. Upwards of 500,000 people were killed. The trouble didn't stop there either. The biggest flashpoint became the region of Kashmir. It had a Muslim majority, but its local Hindu ruler decided to join India. That single decision immediately sparked the first war between India and Pakistan, and it created a conflict over that territory that remains an incredibly dangerous source of tension to this very day. Now, another deeply consequential story unfolded in Palestine. Okay, so before World War I, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. After the war, the Ottomans collapsed, and Britain was put in charge. A huge turning point was the 1917 Balfour Declaration, where Britain supported the idea of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This encouraged Jewish migration, which, as you can imagine, created a lot of tension with the local Arab population. This all came to a head in 1948 when the UN proposed a partition plan. Israel declared its independence, war broke out immediately, and that conflict has been shaping the Middle East ever since. But, the challenges weren't always about borders drawn by outsiders. Even without a war with a neighbor, some of the most devastating struggles were entirely internal, as these new nations tried to figure out how to build a stable society from the ground up. And the case of Cambodia is a truly horrific reminder of this. After gaining independence from France, the country was eventually taken over by the Khmer Rouge. Their radical, unbelievably violent regime led to the deaths of around 2 million of their own people, from mass killings, starvation, and disease. That's a huge chunk of the country's population gone. Okay, beyond just surviving border wars and internal conflicts, these new nations faced another monumental task: building a working economy. How do you actually break free from colonial dependence and create prosperity for your people? Well, people tried a lot of different things. A very common approach was for the government to take the lead. So in Egypt, you had Nasser launching massive state-run projects like the Aswan Dam. In India, Indira Gandhi pushed the Green Revolution in agriculture while also nationalizing key industries. And then, in places like Tanzania and Sri Lanka, leaders went with socialist policies, like cooperative farming and land redistribution. But what this really shows is that there was no magic formula. India's Green Revolution, for instance, was a huge success. It dramatically boosted food production. But the socialist experiments in places like Tanzania and Sri Lanka, they often struggled to deliver the economic growth they promised. It just proved how incredibly difficult the economic side of nation building really was. All right, let's move on to our final theme, and it's a profound one. It's not really about politics or economics, it's about people. Specifically, it's about the mass movement of populations from the former colonies back to the old centers of empire. And the key word to understand here is metropole. It sounds a little academic, but it's a simple idea. The metropole is just the home country of the former empire. So for India, the metropole was Britain. For Algeria, it was France. It's the old imperial center. So here's the fascinating twist. Even after these countries fought for independence, deep connections remained: shared language, cultural ties, economic links. So when jobs were scarce or there was instability at home, many people looked to the old metropole for opportunities. This led to huge waves of migration. People from South Asia moving to Britain, Algerians to France, Filipinos to the United States, all seeking work and education. And this had a massive impact, not so much on the former colonies, but on the metropolis themselves. Countries like Britain and France, which had been largely homogeneous, were fundamentally transformed. They became the diverse, multicultural societies we see today, a direct and lasting legacy of their own imperial past playing out right at home. So when you boil it all down, the crucial point is this: the end of empire was not a single event. It wasn't like flipping a switch from colony to country. It was really the start of a messy, ongoing cascade of changes, political, economic, and social, that in many ways we're still trying to navigate today. Which leaves us with one final thought to chew on. When you look at the world right now, the messy borders, the economic struggles, the movements of people we've been talking about, how do you think these legacies of empire are still shaping international relations, national identities, and even our own communities in the 21st century? It's a question worth thinking about.